There is a particular kind of silence that only widows know. Martha Thornton had become a woman who understood this silence completely. Out here in the New Mexico territory in 1873, with aspen trees bleeding gold and winter approaching, Martha existed in the rhythm she had inherited. The morning work, the afternoon work, the evening work, and then the silence where she sat with nothing at all. This is the story of Martha Thornton, widow, homesteader, on land her late husband William had claimed. The land was good, a valley with a spring, a cabin, a small barn, fencing. The landscape was vast, where her cabin was a small dark square on an enormous canvas of sage and stone. Martha had been at the spring that October morning because the mornings ran clearest. She filled large iron pots slowly, feeling the ache in her knuckles that came each year. Her hands were stained with work, the work of feeding herself, repairing, chopping, tending. She was out of breath by the third pot because filling them had grown harder and she had no one to help. That was when she saw the girl. The girl was at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 200 yards away, partially obscured by tall grass and shadows. She was small, maybe 9 or 10. She wore Apache clothing, earth-toned and practical. More than the clothing, Martha saw the state of the girl. She was standing still, which was desperation. A child stands still because running has become too costly. The girl's frame was thin with deprivation. More than the clothing, Martha saw the state of the girl. The girl was standing still, which in itself was a kind of desperation. A child who stands still in the open does so because running has become too costly. Martha could see, even from that distance, that the girl's frame was thin in a way that suggested not the normal thinness of a growing child, but the thinness of deprivation. Her face was turned slightly toward Martha, watching. Martha's first thought was not kind. Her first thought was fear. Practical, immediate fear for her own safety. An Apache child alone in the open at this hour, this time of year, suggested circumstances that Martha knew, in the way that all women on the frontier knew, could bring danger. Raiders, separated groups, trouble that had a way of spreading from those who created it to those who simply happened to be nearby. But that first thought lasted only as long as it took Martha to see the girl's eyes. They were not the eyes of a warrior or a hunter. They were the eyes of something that had been frightened for a long time and had begun to accept that this frightening would not stop. Martha did what she did not think about doing. She set down the pots. She walked toward the girl slowly, the way one walks toward a fawn that might bolt. She held her hands up, empty, no weapon. She said nothing, because words were blunt instruments for what Martha needed to convey. When she was 30 feet away, the girl took a step backward. Martha stopped. When she was 20 feet away, the girl looked over her shoulder, back toward the trees and the wash beyond, as if calculating the distance between where she stood and safety. Martha stopped again. When Martha was close enough that she could see the dust on the girl's face and the way her ribs pressed against her dress with each breath, she knelt down. This was the moment that changed everything. This was the moment that Martha Thornton, widow and homesteader, owner of a small plot of land that she had successfully kept during 5 years of her own survival, chose something different from the voice in her head that was cataloging every reason why she should turn around, fill her pots, go back to her cabin, and lock the door. She knelt down, and she looked at the girl, and something in the girl's face shifted. A calculation. A moment where the calculus of fear, and hope rearranged itself just slightly. Martha reached into the pocket of her skirt and withdrew a piece of bread that she had wrapped there that morning. She held it out, not aggressively, not trying to move closer, just holding it where the girl could see it. The girl's eyes went to the bread and did not leave it. Martha understood then that she was not dealing with an issue of trust. She was dealing with an issue of hunger so complete that it had overridden caution. The girl stepped forward and took the bread, and she ate it in 3 swift bites, and then she looked at Martha again, and her eyes were still hungry, but now they also held something new, a possibility. The girl's name, which Martha learned over the next 3 days without knowing if the sounds she was producing were actually the girl's name or simply the closest her mouth could come to the Apache words, seemed to be something like Yiska or Siska, a soft sound with a hard beginning. Martha called her Siska to be safe, and the girl did not object, which seemed to Martha like assent. The girl told her story in the way children tell stories when their English is uncertain. Separated 3 days before when the camp moved at night. A scout who should have been watching had gone to help elsewhere. A small child alone in the dark, moving as far as her legs would carry her, then farther, because staying still meant freezing. Martha brought the girl inside. She heated water, washed the girl's face and hands, found a blanket, and wrapped her. She fed her soup, watching the girl's hands shake as she brought the spoon to her mouth again and again. The girl slept before the fire. Martha slept in the chair by the window, awake, listening for hooves. No one came that first night. By the second day, Siska told Martha more. The camp was to the north. Her mother was there. Her father had been killed 2 years before. She had walked south by accident in the darkness and could not find her way back. The days were growing cold. The nights were colder. Martha listened to this, and she did not think about the implications. She thought instead about the child before her, who was becoming, with each bowl of soup and each night's sleep, visibly less like someone who was in the process of dying. The girl's color was returning. Her eyes were becoming alert. She smiled once on the second morning, watching Martha struggle with the fire, and the smile was so unexpected and so complete that Martha found herself pausing in what she was doing to simply witness it. By the third day, Siska was moving around the cabin, helping in small ways. She understood work. She carried water from the barrel to Martha. She helped fold the blankets and hang them in the sun. Her hands, though small, were competent. She knew how to braid grass and seemed to be making something, a kind of woven rope or decoration, though Martha did not ask about it. It was on the afternoon of the third day that Tom Hargrove rode onto her property. Tom Hargrove was not a man who announced himself. He simply appeared at her property's boundary and rode toward the cabin as if he owned it. There were 2 men with him, Seth Paulson, who worked for Hargrove, and a stranger weathered by sun and drink. Martha was hanging clothes when she saw them. She had been trying to wash something of Siska's dress, a thing that the girl had worn when Martha brought her inside, something that was caked with dust and the travel of 3 days alone. Siska was inside the cabin. Martha had not told her to hide, but the girl had seemed to sense that the arrival of riders meant a moment of caution, and she had simply withdrawn to the back room where Martha slept. Hargrove dismounted as if he owned the land. He was a large man of 50, with a face that showed only dominion. He had been trying to buy her land for 3 years with increasingly unfair offers and threats about her competence. "Morning to you, Martha," he said, and she hated the way he used her name, the way he had never once called her Mrs. Thornton. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, not moving from the clothesline. "I've got a situation," he said. "An Apache girl, probably 8 or 9 years old. She's been spotted moving across my land in the last 2 days. Been spotted moving toward here, as a matter of fact. I'm concerned about what she might do. I'm concerned about what she's after. I'm more concerned about the trouble that a wild Apache child running loose around here is going to bring down on all of us." Martha said nothing. "I'm here to ask you directly," he continued, "if you have seen any sign of such a child." Martha looked at him. She thought about the taste of bread. She thought about Siska's ribs and the way the girl had eaten soup. She thought about the small woven thing that the girl was making in the back room. She thought about how long it had been since she had another person in her cabin, even a small person, even a person from whom she could learn nothing but the sound of another voice. "No," she said, "I have not seen any child." Hargrove's expression did not change. "Because if you had, Martha, you'd tell me. Because harboring a hostile tribal member, even a child, is a federal matter. It's the kind of thing that brings soldiers. It's the kind of thing that makes a person look like they're siding with the enemy. And a widow, alone, with no protection around her. Well, that's a vulnerable position to be in if the community decides she's not trustworthy." He said it all in a pleasant tone of voice. He could have been remarking on the weather. "I understand," Martha said. "I'm sure you do," he said. "The general store in town. Reeves, the owner. He's asked me to let you know that he's having a hard time justifying the credit he's been extending to you. He thinks maybe he ought to cut you off until you can pay up the balance. I told him I didn't think that would be necessary if things stayed straightforward." He turned his horse. The other 2 men turned their horses. They rode off the way they had come, and Martha stood with the damp cloth in her hands and watched them go, and she felt something in her chest that she could not name, but that resembled, more than anything else, the moment before a dam breaks. That evening, Martha brought Siska out to sit by the fire, and they did not speak about what had happened, because Siska's English was still uncertain enough that explaining the kind of threat that Hargrove represented would require a language more complex than Martha could manage, and Siska, in any case, had lived her entire life in the presence of threat. They sat together, and Martha felt the weight of what she had chosen. The following day, she rode into town. The settlement was called Mesquite Crossing. It was a place of perhaps 200 people, ranchers, shopkeepers, and the usual collection of people who came to frontier towns to escape or to forget. Martha knew most of them by sight and the way frontier people know each other, not as friends, but as neighbors. She went to the general store first. Reeves was there, a thin man with the kind of face that seemed to have been designed to look perpetually interested in his ledger, even when he was speaking to someone. When he saw Martha, he nodded, but did not look at her directly. "We need to talk about my account," Martha said. Reeves looked uncomfortable. "Times are hard, Martha. I've got my own situation." "How much do I owe?" Martha asked. He told her, and it was not an inconsiderable amount. It was the price of flour and salt and the tools that she had needed for the year, and it was also the price of living, which meant that it was a debt that could only be paid by living long enough to accumulate the money to pay it. "I can give you $50, Martha said, and she produced coins from the purse she had brought, money that she had saved from the sale of hides and the careful selling of surplus from her garden. It was nearly all she had. Reeves took it, and he seemed relieved. But when Martha asked him for credit for the coming winter supplies, he looked at his ledger and said that he thought they ought to wait and see how things developed before they made any more agreements. Martha nodded. She did not feel angry. She felt something closer to clarity. She had chosen her path, and now she was seeing the edges of what that path would require. She left the store and walked to the office where the town's constable kept his desk. The constable was a man named Garrett Webb, a former soldier who had taken the position because it was work and because he had no other prospects. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man who understood that his position depended on not making decisions that upset the people who had hired him. "I want to file a complaint," Martha said. Webb looked at her over his cup of coffee. "About what?" "Tom Hargrove came to my property and made threats," Martha said. "He implied that he would use his influence to make my life difficult if I did not cooperate with something he wanted." Webb set down his coffee. "What is it he wants?" "I can't say," Martha said. Webb's face became very still. He took a long time before he spoke. "Martha, there's not much I can do if you can't tell me what the threat was about." "He's trying to force me to sell my land," Martha said, which was true, but which was not the whole truth, and they both knew it. "Land disputes are civil matters," Webb said. "You'd need a lawyer. I can give you a name, though I don't know if he'd take your case." Martha left the office, knowing that she had done what she had done, and that it would matter, but not in the way she had hoped. By evening, everyone in Mesquite Crossing would know that Martha Thornton had gone to the constable, and that she had refused to say what it was about. That night, Martha sat alone in the cabin, and Siska slept by the fire, and Martha was afraid in a way that she had not been afraid in 5 years. The fear was not the immediate fear of danger. No riders had come to burn the cabin or drive her from the land. The fear was the deeper fear of isolation, of having stepped across a line and knowing that the line was one way, that you could not step back across it once you had stepped over. She thought about William, who had died defending land that could not be defended, because the Apache had every right to it that he did, because he had been a soldier in a war that was not righteous, even if the newspapers said it was. She thought about how he had left her this land, and this cabin, and this isolation, and how his death had not been a noble death, but a death that came from violence and fear, and the breaking of promises. She thought about how, if William had lived, they would have had children by now, and she would not be sitting alone in a dark cabin wondering if she had just destroyed her own future. But she could not give Siska back to the desert. She could not send her out into the cold with winter coming. So, Martha did what people do in such moments. She waited. For the next week and a half, no one came. The weather turned colder. Martha brought in wood from the pile she had cut the previous month, stacking it high against the wall of the cabin. She prepared the cabin for winter, checking the chinking between the logs, ensuring that the roof had no obvious leaks, tightening the leather hinges on the shutters. Siska helped with all of it. The girl was clever with her hands and seemed to understand what needed to be done without always being told. On the afternoon of the 8th day, Martha saw the riders. They came from the direction of Hargrove's ranch, and there were 4 of them. They were not soldiers. They were hired hands, including Seth Paulson, and they came at a time of day when the light was still good enough that Martha would see them coming for a long way. This seemed deliberate. Martha told Siska to go into the back room and to be silent. Then she took William's rifle from the shelf where she kept it, a rifle that she had learned to shoot in the years after his death. a skill that had seemed practical at the time, and that now seemed like the most dangerous skill she had ever acquired. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and waited for the riders to arrive. Paulson dismounted first. "Martha, we're here about the girl," he said, and there was no friendliness in his voice, but there was also nothing that could be called hostility. He was simply doing what he had been told to do, and his tone suggested that he understood this would be unpleasant, but that it was work. "There is no girl," Martha said, and the rifle was held low, but not hidden. "There's been reports," another man said. "People have seen an Apache girl heading this way. We're here to look around, make sure you're safe." "I am safe," Martha said. "One of us just wants to look in the back room," Paulson said. "That's all, just a look." Martha raised the rifle. She did not point it at anyone. She simply raised it in a way that made it clear that she would. "You will not look in the back room. You will not enter my cabin. You will turn your horses around, and you will leave." Paulson looked at her, and Martha could see him making some calculation, weighing whether she would actually use the rifle against what his job was, and what the consequences would be if he backed down. He was a man with a family, Martha knew. He had been kind to William once, years ago, in some way that William had mentioned to her. He was not a cruel man. "All right," he said. "We'll go. But Martha, you need to understand something. Hargrove's going to keep coming. This is only going to get worse." "I understand," Martha said. They rode away, and Martha watched them go, and she stood in the doorway with the rifle until they were out of sight. Then she went back inside, and Siska came out of the back room, and the girl looked at Martha, and something passed between them. Not words, but a kind of recognition. The cold came down hard after that. The first snow fell in early November and seemed decided to stay. Martha had prepared. She had wood from the cottonwoods along the wash, the cabin insulated, and enough dried meat, vegetables, flour, and salt to last the winter. Martha had not gone back to town since the day she had filed the complaint that accomplished nothing. The store would not extend her credit, and so she used what resources she had and made them stretch. She had preserved vegetables in the root cellar. She had enough flour. She had shot a deer in early November, and the meat hung from the roof of the small shed behind the cabin, frozen now in the cold. They were not wealthy, but they were not starving. One night in mid-November, when the snow was deep, Martha stood at the window and saw figures on horseback crossing the white landscape. Martha understood then that the girl's people had been watching. They had been waiting. They had been observing, the way that the skill of observation was something that came from necessity, from lives lived in the presence of threat. Siska saw the smoke, and Martha understood that the girl was not wondering if her people knew she was here. She was knowing it. She was feeling it. She was understanding that the people she had come from had not forgotten her. "Your mother," Martha said. It was not a question. Siska nodded. She was silent for a long moment, and then she said something in her own language, words that Martha did not understand, but that sounded like a kind of answer or a kind of goodbye. "They will not come now," Martha said. "It is too cold. They will not come until the winter breaks." Siska nodded, and she seemed to understand this, and she seemed also to understand something else, that Martha was afraid, and that this fear was something different from the fear that had driven the men to ride out to the cabin. This fear was the fear of loss, the fear of someone understanding that they had found something, and that the finding had been temporary. The rest of winter passed in days that blurred together. Martha kept the fire alive, heated water, watched Siska. But the days stopped being a burden and became a rhythm. There was Siska's breathing in the darkness, the sound of the fire, something that might have been contentment. The absence of that particular loneliness only widows know. But somewhere in that time, Martha stopped counting the days until Siska's family came. She stopped thinking of the girl's presence as temporary. They fell into a routine so complete that it began to seem like something that could last forever, or at least something that had lasted so long already that its ending seemed impossible. Siska had learned almost 30 words of English by the time the snow began to recede in March. She could say water and fire and danger and stay. She could say Martha, and the way she said it was not the way a servant says an employer's name, but the way a child says the name of someone who has become necessary to their existence. In the last week of March, Martha woke to the sound of hooves. This was different from the sound of Paulson and his riders. This was the sound of many hooves, moving in an organized way, approaching from the north. Martha was out of bed and pulling her clothes on before she was fully awake. She went to the window and looked out into the dawn light, and she saw them on the land beyond the pasture, perhaps 50 riders, moving in a line that suggested neither threat nor approach, but simply movement, a people moving across land that they had a right to move across. Siska was already awake. She was standing at the window, and when Martha came to stand beside her, the girl's hand came up and found Martha's, and Martha held it. The riders did not come toward the cabin. Instead, they moved across the land in a way that suggested they were moving toward the settlement, toward Mesquite Crossing. They moved with a kind of deliberation that suggested purpose, and Martha understood in the way that understanding came to her, not in words but in sensation, that this was not a raiding party. This was something else. She dressed Siska. She dressed herself. She did not know what else to do, so she did what she had learned to do in times of uncertainty. She prepared food, she drew water, she arranged the cabin in a way that suggested normalcy and order. By mid-morning, a single rider had separated from the group. He was riding toward the cabin, and the way he rode suggested neither haste nor aggression. Martha watched him come. He was an older man, perhaps 60, with a face that had the quality of weathered leather, and he was mounted on a horse that was clearly a fine animal. He wore a feathered headdress, which Martha understood to mean something about authority or standing, though she did not know what exactly. He dismounted when he was perhaps 50 feet from the cabin. He did not approach closer. Instead, he stood beside his horse, and he waited. Martha understood that this was her moment. She took Siska's hand, and they walked out of the cabin together into the morning light, and the man watched them come. He spoke in Apache, and Siska replied in Apache, and there was a moment of exchange that Martha did not understand, but that seemed to her, watching it, to be of tremendous importance. The man looked at Martha, and then he looked back at Siska, and his face seemed to show something like, Martha could not think of the word, recognition, respect, certainty. He turned to his horse and made a sound that was not quite a word, but that seemed to carry meaning. Another rider came forward, leading 3 horses. The chief. Martha understood that this was what he was, though she did not know his name and did not ask it, gestured to the horses. Then he stepped toward Martha. He looked at her directly, and the look was of the kind that Martha understood to be a measuring of who she was and what she had done. He said something in careful English. You carried her. You gave her life when there was no reason. The desert would have taken her. but you stopped. You decided to decide otherwise. Martha had no words for this. She was thinking of bread and soup, and a girl's hand in darkness, and the weight of all the choices that had led to this moment. "We are bound," the chief said, "not the binding of blood, the binding of debt, a debt that a person must pay, and a debt that a people must honor." He gestured to the horses again. "These are for you, for the winter that came, for the food that you gave, for the choice that you made." Then he turned to Siska, and he spoke in Apache, and the girl's face crumpled, and she understood that this was the moment of leaving. She looked at Martha, and something passed between them, grief and gratitude, and the knowledge that a thing had been real, even though it was ending. "Tell her," Martha said, and she could not finish the sentence because she did not know what to tell her. Siska let go of Martha's hand, and she walked to the chief, and she mounted one of the horses. The chief mounted his horse. The other rider moved to the second horse and waited. Martha understood then. She walked to the second horse, and she felt the chief's eyes on her, and she turned to face him. "You do not leave alone," he said. "No widow leaves alone. A person who chooses as you have chosen is bound to a people. You will come to our winter camp. You will see that the girl is safe. You will see that we are people, not the things that the territory says we are. You will tell this when you return." Martha rode with them. She rode through the morning and into the afternoon, and they moved into high country where the snow was still thick and where the air was thin and cold. They did not speak as they rode, but Siska sometimes turned in her saddle to look back at Martha, and Martha could see relief on her face and grief at the same time. When they reached the camp, it was at dusk, and there were perhaps 200 people, and fires were burning, and there was the smell of food cooking and animals and smoke. A woman came running toward them, and Martha understood, before anything was said, that this was Siska's mother. She gathered the girl into her arms and made sounds that required no translation. The chief led Martha to a shelter and indicated that she should wait. Food was brought to her, meat and corn and beans, and it was served with a courtesy that suggested honor, not captivity. By morning, Martha understood her role. She was to be a witness. She was to see the tribe's life, its order, its humanity. She was to see Kiska reunited with her family, thriving, safe. She was to take this knowledge back to the territory, back to Mesquite Crossing, back to the people who believed that Apache were something less than human. She stayed for 3 days, and in those 3 days she learned the names of Siska's parents and her brother. She ate with them. She worked alongside the women, and her hands were recognized as the hands of someone who understood work. On the last evening, Siska's mother gave Martha a woven blanket, the thing that Siska had been weaving all winter, the gift that the girl had made while sitting by the fire in Martha's cabin. When Martha returned to her homestead, she found that things had changed. There was no cabin burned, no property destroyed. Instead, there was something that Hargrove had not predicted. There were tracks around her property, hoof prints that suggested regular observation. There was a cleared patch of wood that had been neatly stacked beside her cabin, enough for the coming winter and the one after. There were signs that someone had left food, though Martha could not find it directly. The most important thing was this. When she rode into Mesquite Crossing the following week, the constable Webb said something to her. He said, "Hargrove's gotten quiet, said something about reconsidering his holdings, said maybe a widow who can command the respect of the tribe is somebody he doesn't want trouble with." The store's owner, Reeves, extended her credit again, without Martha even asking. The winters that came after that one were lonely, but they were not desperate. The tribe never came again to collect on their debt, but Martha understood that this was what respect looked like. Not endless obligation, but the knowledge that a debt had been recognized and honored through restraint. She kept the blanket that Siska had woven. She hung it on the wall of her cabin, where the firelight touched it every evening. Every spring, when the weather broke and the passes opened, Martha would ride to a place on the ridge where she could see the smoke of the tribe's encampment, and she would leave a gift there, flour, tools, whatever she could spare. And the smoke would move slightly, as if in acknowledgement. The difference between an enemy and an ally is rarely as great as we think it is. Sometimes it is only the difference between deciding to see another person and deciding to turn away. Martha Thornton, widow and homesteader, had decided, on an October morning in 1873, to see. And that decision, though it had cost her much and had asked her to sacrifice the safety of isolation, had given her something that no amount of land or security could have bought her. It had given her the knowledge that her life had mattered, that a choice made in the right direction could ripple outward and change the shape of the world around her. Subscribe to Western Hearts in Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor, and tell us in the comments. Would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one. Moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.